Okay. Exodus chapter 20. This is part 6 in a series that I've entitled Breaking the Law. And we've been making our way through the 10 Commandments. And this week we get to Exodus chapter 20, verse 13. A very simple, straightforward, seemingly relative easy to keep command. All it says is this. Exodus chapter 20, verse 13. You must not murder. Maybe we can keep that one. Maybe not. We'll see. So this past week, I, along with my good friends Jean LaRue and Byron Yawn, spent every day, all day, up here recording 2 entire seasons of a new podcast that will drop on October 31st. It's called Misfit Preachers, and all 3 of us qualify. And we talked about a lot of stuff. I mean, we recorded, 20 episodes, something like that, 20 episodes in a 5-day period. We're all exhausted. But we talked about a lot of things. We talked about losing. We talked about sin. We talked about desperation and relapse and broken relationships and grace and hope and recovery and the power of self-awareness and non-blinking friends. We talked about all that stuff and more. And as we talked, I was reminded of how helpful the 10 Commandments are. Sometimes I'll get criticized for being a sin leveler. If that doesn't make sense to you, I'll explain it. People say from time to time, well, isn't it convenient for this guy to say all sin is the same? It's just a ploy to get myself off the hook for some of the heinous things I've done. And to that, I say 2 things to that charge, to that criticism. Number 1, no one is suggesting that all sins are the same when it comes to horizontal consequences. Okay, for example, the consequences of adultery are far more severe than the consequences of lust. So no one's suggesting that all sins are the same when it comes to horizontal consequences. But there was no greater sin leveler in history than Jesus. All you have to do is read the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5, 6, and 7. He preached that sermon to a bunch of people who thought they were better than a bunch of other people, and he wanted to level the playing field. He routinely used God's law to expose the blindness of those who thought they were better than others, and said things like, why do you look for the speck in someone else's eye and ignore the log in your own? That entire sermon was an attack on the self-righteousness that exists in all of us. That's the first thing I would say. The second thing I would say is using the law to level the playing field doesn't let me off the hook. Rather, it hangs us all on one. And we hate that. Hate it. You can gauge the degree of one's self-righteousness by how they react to the truth that before God, no one is better or worse than anyone else. Depending on how someone reacts to that, you can gauge your level or their level of self-righteousness. Our drug of choice these days is knowing who we're better than, which is why cancel culture went viral. We love that stuff. We love knowing who we're better than. I read this a couple weeks ago from Jamie Kilstein, who's a writer, radio host, stand-up comic, guy in his early 40s. Super insightful, and I think he describes very well what I'm saying. He wrote, we don't root for redemption anymore. We don't actually care if people change. In fact, we don't want them to become better. We want to watch them burn so we can sit back and temporarily feel better about our own lives. That's why cancel culture went viral. Our drug of choice these days is knowing who we're better than. Well, the 10 Commandments don't let us get away with any of that stuff, which is why I love them. They level the playing field. The Ten Commandments are meant to expose what the Apostle Paul said in Romans 3 when he said, there is no one righteous. And then for emphasis, he adds, not even one. The Ten Commandments are meant to show us what Jesus told the rich young ruler when he said, there is no one good but God. No one. The Ten Commandments are intended to reveal that we're not basically good, that no one is better than anyone else. The Ten Commandments are not a ladder that we climb in order to get better. They are an impassable wall we crash into so that we'll finally admit we need grace. We need outside help. We need mercy. But we may have a loophole this week, okay? We may have a loophole. You shall not murder. I mean, for most of us, we could sit back and go, okay, I understand, Tullian, that we violate these other commands in these various ways, but try to show me how I'm a murderer, okay? I mean, we have finally arrived at the one commandment that most of us can say we haven't broken. And the only reason I say most of us is because I don't know all of you, and you may have killed somebody for all I know. But week after week in this series, I've annoyed you by showing how each commandment demands far more from us than we might think, exposing us far more thoroughly than we could ever imagine. But here, finally, a straightforward, no-nonsense command that we are sure we haven't broken. Whenever I was caught doing something bad as a kid, which was often, I would typically defend myself by yelling, well, at least I haven't killed anyone. I didn't kill anyone, Mom. I mean, we use this commandment as a defense for our not-so-badness. This is the first commandment we typically think of when we're desperate to feel decent about ourselves. I may be guilty of lying. I may be guilty of cheating. But I'm no murderer. I mean, at least in this place, at this commandment, I'm innocent. As I said, we use this commandment as a defense for our not-so-badness. We use this commandment as a gauge to help us feel better about ourselves in comparison to the worst people that we know. At least we're no murderer. We've done some bad things. None of us would claim that we're perfect. But clearly we're better than that person. Well, all you have to do is flip forward to Matthew chapter 5, verses 21 to 22, to see that this commandment might actually expose us more, not less, than any of the others. So I'm going to read, these are verses that I've read to you many times before. I'm going to read Matthew chapter 5. This is a part of the Sermon on the Mount. And Jesus is teaching about anger, and he says this in verses 21 and 22. You have heard that our ancestors were told, you must not murder. If you commit murder, you are subject to judgment. As I mentioned a few weeks ago, the Sermon on the Mount is Jesus' sermon on the Ten Commandments. He's preaching on the Ten Commandments in this sermon. So he says, again, you've heard that our ancestors were told you must not murder. If you commit murder, you are subject to judgment. But I say, if you are even angry with someone, you are subject to judgment. If you call someone an idiot, you are in danger of being brought before the court. And if you curse someone, you are in danger of the fires of hell. So Jesus takes it up a notch. And when he does, what he shows is that all of us are much more guilty of breaking this commandment than we might initially think. Jesus shows that keeping this command extends to what goes on inside of us. Not just external actions, but internal feelings and motives. Not just what we do, but what we think, what we feel, what we say. Human defense systems, okay, and this is just universally true. Human defense systems live by the distinction between thought and deed. So, for example, therapists are always telling patients that it's okay to have the thought so long as it doesn't lead to the act. I mean, wanting to kill someone is one thing, but actually killing someone is another matter. Only in the eyes of the state, not the eyes of God. That's what Jesus is saying here. That's how mind-blowing this sermon, Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, was. I mean, can you imagine people standing there, religious leaders, people who had tried to be good their entire lives, being told by Jesus, these are people who had studied the Bible, who had gone to seminary, who were religious professionals, and they're standing there, and Jesus says to them, "You are no better before God than the person being executed this afternoon for murder." I mean, the rage. They were incensed. No wonder they wanted this guy dead. They wanted to shut him up. Every time he opened his mouth to these people, he was saying, "You're no better than the worst people you know. You think you're better than. You think you are morally superior to these people that you look down on. You're not. And the fact that you're blind to that means you're actually further from grace than they are." Oh my gosh, they hated that. I mean, religion has always been allergic to grace. Always. Always. Jesus insists that in God's economy, there is an equality between intention and action, thought and deed. The thought-deed distinction is a clever defense mechanism which prevents us from seeing how bad we really are. And this distinction fuels our judgmentalism. It fuels self-righteousness. Well, I may have thought it, but he did it. Therefore, I'm better than him. Only in the eyes of the state, not in the eyes of God. But if that wasn't bad enough, Jesus takes it up a notch. It's not just anger, it's any kind of insult, spoken or unspoken. How many times have you called someone an idiot? I called 3 drivers an idiot this morning on my way to church. According to this verse, I should burn in hell for that, okay? And notice what Jesus does here. He takes intention out of it. So even unintentional insulting is a breaking of this commandment. I mean, how many of us have insulted someone without even intending to? Too bad, guilty. Just as guilty as a murderer before God. Jesus shows that this commandment does not just forbid the external act of killing, it also forbids killing others in our thoughts and in our attitudes and with our words. So Henry Nouwen, a writer, once said that nobody is shot with a bullet who is not first shot with a word. And nobody is shot with a word who is not first shot with a thought. Killing is not just a brute external act. It is, in its more common form, an internal issue of the heart. This is what Jesus is getting at. This is what this command is getting at. It's cutting through the exterior into our hearts. We kill people all the time. All the time. We kill people with the vicious judgments we make about them in our hearts and behind their backs. He's the worst. She's so annoying. He always has to be the center of attention. She's so fake. All he cares about is himself. She's so concerned with how she looks. I mean, we make judgments like this all the time. Even if we don't speak them, we think them, we feel them. What breaks this commandment is not just the physical act of murder or even the physical acts of bullying or abuse or losing your temper. Harsh judgment, slander, gossip, resentment, digging in and holding a grudge, lack of forgiveness. All of these are a breaking of this commandment. And when you look at it that way, then we all have to admit we're guilty. None of us are innocent. None of us do not have blood on our hands. One writer broke it down like this, and this is remarkably insightful. In our envy of others, we kill their spontaneity. In our criticism of others, we kill their enthusiasm. In our refusal to affirm and encourage others, we help kill their capacity to love. With our suspicions, we kill trust. In our broken commitments, we kill relationships. In our infidelities, we kill the bond that makes for family. In our laziness, we kill creativity. In our abuse of food, alcohol, and drugs, we kill our own bodies. In our excesses, we kill enjoyment. In the harsh thoughts we have, we kill each other's capacity to be free and joyous. And what that means is that every single one of us are perpetrators of death. All of us. So much more so than we realize. So much more so. And the proof is that sadness and fear and suspicion and joylessness are all around us. Well, where does that stuff come from? From a company of murderers constantly killing each other in a variety of different ways. When we refuse to dumb this commandment down and make it doable, I can keep this. You shall not murder. Don't murder anybody. I can keep this. When we refuse to dumb it down and we look at it much more deeply, the way that Jesus wants us to look at it, we can't help but conclude that murderers are not some tiny subset of the population to be kept tucked away in a maximum security prison. This commandment breaks down the prison walls. Not to let the murderers out, but to expand the prison. We're all murderers, if not by deed, then by thought, word, feeling. We're all guilty in this regard. In fact, as I was reading through these commandments, this was the one that I was able to relate to the most. I mean, rather than this being the commandment that makes me step back and go, I can keep this one, I step back from this commandment and go, this one exposes me more than all the others. Because when you look at it the way Jesus looks at it, it exposes all of us, every part of us. But once again, thankfully, that's the bad news, okay? You're all murderers, okay? You're all killers, you're all murderers, okay? That's the bad news. I am too, we all are. There is no one on planet Earth that is not. We are no better in our hearts than the worst serial killer that has ever lived, according to Jesus. If it's inside of us, we are guilty, and it is. That's why Jesus says the things that he says. That's why the Apostle Paul says, there is no one righteous, not even one. That's why Jesus says to the rich young ruler, there is no one good but God. Jesus is the great sin leveler, putting us all on common ground. So that's the bad news. None of us get out of this without blood on our hands. But here's the good news, okay? This is the good news. What we are incapable of doing, this commandment that we are incapable of keeping, along with all the others, God has done for us. He's kept this command for us. When Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount, I haven't come to abolish the rules, I've come to keep them for you, because you've broken all of them. So I haven't come to sweep them under the rug, I've come to keep them for you, so that all of my law keeping would then be credited to your bankrupt account. So that when God looks at you, he doesn't see a law breaker, he sees a law keeper. So the demand maker became the demand keeper to save us demand breakers. That's the beauty of the law. It crushes us, it cuts us off at the knees, and it fights self-righteousness. That part of us that desperately needs or desperately wants to feel better than someone else. I mean, Jesus just sort of cuts that off at the root. As Jesus hung, just think about some of the episodes, just his crucifixion. for instance. As he hung on the cross, he was mocked. He saved others. Why can't he save himself? Mocking him. He was dying not for any crime. He was being killed because people were jealous. People were bitter. People could not stand hearing that they weren't better than anyone else, and they killed him for it. That's how resistant we are to being unmasked, to being exposed. It was the religious community that killed Jesus. Religious community that did it. And as he hung on that cross, being mocked, he saved others. Why can't he save himself? I mean, they were very proud of themselves. I mean, it's one thing to retaliate it's one thing to not retaliate when you are outmanned and underpowered. But Jesus could have obliterated the enemy with one word. I mean, had I been Jesus and I would have heard that kind of mocking, I mean, lightning bolts would have come from my eyes. I would have killed everybody, okay? I mean, he had every opportunity to give in to a murderous rage, and he would have been justified in doing so. After all, God was being mocked. We feel justified in our murderous thoughts when God is being mocked. Justified. That kind of stuff comes out a lot in election years. We feel so justified in our hatred and in our murderous thoughts about candidates, regardless of whether they're on the left or the right. Well, we have to defend God. We have to protect God. God is being mocked, and we justify that. But Jesus was arrested. He was tortured. He was mocked for being innocent. The only non-murderer who ever lived, ever. And he was killed for it. Well, how does he respond to this injustice that's happening to him? To being mocked? I mean, I know how my kids get when their father is mocked. I mean, my oldest son, Gabe, would put bullets in your head, okay, if he heard anyone mocking his dad. Well, I mean, Jesus' dad was being mocked. And instead of giving into this murderous rage and then justifying that, they're making fun of my dad. I'm going after him. What does he do instead? Father, forgive them. They have no idea what the hell they're doing. No idea. Where we give in to murderous rages in our hearts and minds, Jesus asks the Father to forgive those who have unjustly ridiculed and beaten him. And that response from Jesus is credited to us. That response by Jesus is now deposited into our account, into our murderous account. I mean, I mentioned I killed 4 people on the way to church this morning. The drivers, especially in the rain, terrible. I mean, the speed, just because it's raining, it doesn't mean the speed limit is now 15, okay? Unbelievable. But Jesus prays for his torturers. I was mildly inconvenienced by someone going a little bit slower than I wanted them to go. And the thoughts and the feelings that erupted instantaneously. And Jesus prays for his torturers. Father, forgive them. They have no idea what they're doing. They have no clue what they're doing. They're blind. Forgive them for their blindness. Forgive them for their self-righteousness. Forgive them for their murderous rages. Forgive them for their resentment and their bitterness and their jealousy. Forgive them. They have no idea what they're doing. He did this for us so that his record of perfect law-keeping could be given to us. What theologians refer as the active obedience of Jesus. Passive obedience of Jesus, according to the theologians, is Jesus taking on our sin. The active obedience of Jesus, the passive is taking on our sin, taking care of the debt. The active obedience of Jesus is Jesus throughout his 33 years, dotting every I, crossing every T, keeping God's law perfectly, and then depositing that perfect record into our account. So the gospel is not just a debt has been paid, it's a deposit has been made. Every one of our murderous thoughts and desires are carried by Jesus to the cross, and every one of his prayers for the forgiveness of others is credited to our mouths. Crazy, amazing grace, outrageous mercy. We deserve none of this, and we get all of it as if we'd done it ourselves. Jesus was murdered to pardon murderers. By weakness and defeat, he won the victor's crown, trod all his foes beneath his feet by being trodden down. Because of what Jesus has done for killers like me, even murder in all of its forms cannot separate me from the love of God. None of my murderous thoughts, none of my murderous feelings, none of my resentments and bitternesses and lack of forgiveness, none of that prevents God from loving me. Now, it might make my life harder and heavier in this world. We all know that to be true. Resentment and bitterness and lack of forgiveness and self-righteousness and all of that stuff makes our lives heavier and harder, but it has no bearing whatsoever on the way God loves us or how God feels about us, because Jesus took care of that problem a long time ago. Because of what Jesus has done for killers like you and for killers like me, none of this stuff that's exposed inside of us causes God to blink. It doesn't cause him to bail. It doesn't cause him to withhold blessings or mercy or grace or forgiveness or love. I've said this many times, but we pay a lot more attention to our sin than God does. A lot more. The things we can't forget, he doesn't even remember. And it's not that he can't remember. He's omniscient, which means he knows all things. It's that he chooses not to remember. Grace, always grace. I have a friend who wrote this a couple years ago in a written interview. And she said this: "There is a reason I am obsessed with grace. There is a reason I have spoken and written and preached about it more than any other thing. And here it is. Because everything else in this bankrupt world feels like it's about worthiness. It's about proving ourselves and knowing who we're better than. Everything else is about making judgments and being the best and winning. Everything that is not rooted in grace that I've been offered in this life, whether from social media or the health industry or higher education or religion, feels like it's all about just trying harder. But I've tried trying harder, and it doesn't make me free. It just makes me tired." So, Jesus says, "Come to me with all of your grudges. Come to me with all of your hate. Come to me with all of your bitternesses, all of your anger. Come to me with all of your unforgiveness. Come to me with all of your resentments and your rancor, and I will give you rest. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." What a gracious invitation. Huge for people like us. Beaten down by our own actions, beaten down by our own thoughts, beaten down by our own feelings. We have failed at doing this stuff. But because Jesus succeeded for us, we are free to fail without sacrificing 1 ounce of God's love for us, because God's love for us is not dependent on what we do, how good we can become, or what we fail to do. God's love for us is entirely dependent on what He has done for us unilaterally, one-way love.